More than ever, forgive me today. Coming down with a mild case of rigor mortis or something along that line, and whatever the symptoms are. So bear with me, and I hope I can keep standing. There's a big chair here. Maybe I'll sit down today. Okay. Genesis 1:1 then. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Two perhaps basic approaches to this, the understanding of this verse on the part of those who see it as an independent statement. There are those who do not see this as an independent statement, but would subordinate it in one way or another, and the Hebrew grammatical questions there are things that we're not going to be dealing with here, but some would so subordinate to this opening verse that it would cease to be any kind of an absolute statement in itself, but it would just be sort of setting the stage for what follows in verse 2, and the net result is that the Bible would be left without any real affirmation of an absolute beginning and an act of God in creation. It would just be that back there when God was creating the world, this already was the situation. The earth was, and so on. So there's that kind of view in the literature. We're not going to be dealing with that, but only with at least two views that understand this as a separate statement, something about in the beginning and God created the heavens and the earth. And these two views, maybe I can set forth in terms of two advocates of them. E.J. Young, we mentioned that after I wrote my earlier article on Because It Had Not Rained, and Dr. Young then responded to that with a series of articles which appeared. You find those? I mentioned them and said you might find them on the reserve shelf. Did anyone find Dr. Young is he did.
Would those be in his book in the beginning, or
that I think is it? Yeah, it's in the beginning. That may be another little thing he did.
When he did studies on Genesis.
That studies in Genesis sounds more like it.
Material overlaps.
Okay. Well, there were three articles that he wrote in the Westminster Journal then that were published. with the one folder binder that should be on our reserve shelf. His view, Dr. Young's view of Genesis 1:1 then was that it is a heading. It is a heading for the whole chapter, like a newspaper heading. It sums up the whole development of things, and it gives the final score. Padres win 8-0. Okay. And once in a while it happens, and that's the headline. And then after that you go, well, what happened in the first inning, and so on. You survey the whole thing. Well, Dr. Young's view of this thing is then that Genesis 1:1 surveys all that follows. Now, what does that mean about the meaning of in the beginning? And for that matter, what does it mean about the meaning of heavens and earth? It would mean that in the beginning would not be the sort of the absolute point of beginning, but it would have this consequence that the whole chapter, everything that transpires within the 6-7 day period, that whole thing is the beginning time. All right. Now then, what happened within the whole compass of that by the time the 7 days were over? What had happened? Well, God had by that time completed the heavens and the earth in their well-formed, well-organized, populated form. And so heavens and earth would not refer to, let's say, the embryonic form of these things at some early beginning point, but it would refer to the finished product, okay? So that's the meaning of the passage, if you take it as not just an independent statement, but as a heading for the whole chapter. The other view, let's see, who I usually use we've mentioned, I guess, a couple of times the work of Alexander Hydel, and he was the one who wrote the so-called Babylonian Genesis, and we'll be making further use of. The Babylonian Genesis then being a translation of the Babylonian creation text, the Enuma Elish. And he also then wrote the thing on the Gilgamesh epic and the Old Testament parallels. Well, in the first of those, in the Babylonian Genesis then, he deals with that and with the question of the relationship between sort of the creation story, which is part of the Enuma Elish, to the point where the hero god Marduk vanquishes Tiamat, the water dragon force, and out of her carcass he proceeds to structure the world. Well, that's the creation story within the Enuma Elish, and so he takes that and he searches out the parallels with Genesis 1:1, and that's an interesting thing, and we'll be doing something, as I say, of that later on. But in the course of doing that, then he deals with this opening verse, and his understanding of it then is that in the beginning is not coextensive with the whole week, but it is at the beginning of that period. And in that case, heavens and earth would not be the finished product as it exists at the end of the whole structuring business, but it would be some early form of heaven and earth before it had yet been given a further shape and definition. Now, in favor of the view of Alexander Heidel that this is not a heading, but that it is describing a early on period before the subsequent developments which are spelled out in Genesis 1 verse 2 and following. In favor of that, there is a passage I want you to turn to in Proverbs now. Proverbs 8. And so our interest in Proverbs 8 right at this point is to see the way in which Bereshit in the beginning, in Genesis 1:1, how that expression in the beginning is interpreted by the inspired author in Proverbs 8. So we'll be doing that at the same time, and this I find fascinating in terms of a defense of the framework interpretation. We will also be seeing that in Proverbs 8 we have, if you will, the framework interpretation given to the whole creation account, because in Proverbs 8 you have the essential feature of the framework interpretation, which is that you, in the first triad of days, proceed through things in terms of a certain theme, and then in the second triad of days you backtrack and go through the same process again from a little different perspective, but that there is a thematic approach that overrides a strictly chronological treatment of the subject. So that is a second thing that we are looking for now as we look at Proverbs 8. In Proverbs 8, we have the figure of the divine wisdom. And in fact, all through the early chapters of Proverbs, we keep encountering the divine wisdom personified as a woman, and over against her there is the foil of the wicked woman, the harlot, the prostitute, who entices people to her place, which is ends up as the gates of death. Over against that, here is the divine woman, the divine wisdom, the woman who calls on us to come to her because what she has to offer is more precious than the rubies and so on, and her ways are the ways of life. So the divine wisdom personified as a woman here figures throughout the thing, and in Proverbs 8, her claims to our attention and embrace, her claims upon us are set forth in terms of the role that she, the divine wisdom, played in connection with the creation of the world. If you are overcome with wonder at the marvels of creation, well, then you should be attracted to the divine wisdom because of the role that she played there. Because as a matter of fact, she was there from the beginning throughout the whole process. And the passage then in Proverbs 8 concludes with a statement of the particular role she played, which was that of a master craftsman. Back before you come already to Proverbs 8, that particular theme of divine wisdom in connection with the creation of the world is anticipated in the third chapter. In verse 19, Proverbs 3:19, just briefly in the midst of another context, it says, "By wisdom the Lord laid the earth's foundations. By understanding he set the heavens in place. By his knowledge the deeps were divided, and the clouds let drop the dew." So here then we have anticipated the imagery of God's wisdom as the great builder, the master builder by whom he laid the foundations of the earth and the heavens and so on. Now then in our passage in the 8th chapter, this is amplified, the same concept, same basic picture, but enlarged, and enlarged by going through the days of Genesis. And the developments that are traced in Genesis, day by day virtually, and showing the presence there of wisdom, and also the function of wisdom. Now the way it divides is that in verses 22 through 26 speak of wisdom before. Now here's where we're going to be getting some insight on the meaning of in the beginning. In the beginning. And what we're going to be finding then in these verses 22 through 26, that expression in the beginning is identified with a period before the developments which are traced from verse 2 and following in Genesis 1. So wisdom, she keeps saying, I was there before he did this, before he did that, before he did the other thing, various things that are described in terms of the first three days, if you will. Then in verses 27 through 31, wisdom tells us that she was there during that process. She was there before it all began, but it isn't just that she is ancient there, but that she was involved in the process, as the third chapter said. It was by wisdom he did all of these things. So the theme then in verses 27 through 31 is that of wisdom and her function in the process of, and as you read through, you find yourself, interestingly, as I said, going back and going through the same precise developments. She was before these developments took place, and you find yourself going through days 1 through 3, and then she was there during that process, and again you find yourself going through that period. Let's look at the text then. There are a lot of individual points that we can't pause over, questions of translation of various terms, and the essential point we can make, irrespective of what English translation you may have with you there. In the 8th chapter then, we begin with the 22nd verse, where wisdom says, the Lord brought me forth as the first of his works. And already your footnotes, you see, in this Bible has as alternative translations, the Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work, or the Lord brought me forth at the beginning of his work. And all right, but the point is, there she is, and here is where now we get the echo of Genesis 1 verse 1, in the beginning. And she says, she was there in the beginning. It's like John 1, the Logos was there in the beginning when the world was being created, at the beginning before the process even started, there on that interface between God's eternity and creational time. There is wisdom right at the beginning. In mentioning the connection with the Logos, I wasn't trying to settle the question of whether in fact this wisdom should be equated with the concept of the incarnate Logos or not. That's an interesting point, that they certainly are dealing with divine figures and their involvement from the beginning in creation, but I think that, obviously the Logos is a person, whereas here in Proverbs 8, the wisdom that is being treated is more an abstract thought of the wisdom of God without respect to being identified with a particular person. But in any case, there is the first expression that wisdom was there at the beginning of his work. And right away then, the meaning of Bereshit is settled because it is identified with a point before his deeds of old. The next verse continues the same point by saying, I was appointed from everlasting, from the beginning again, before the world began. Now there's your inspired interpretation, if you will, of Genesis 1:1. In the beginning is before the world began. It is in the beginning is not coextensive with the whole process of the development of the creation of the heaven and the earth. So I think that the view espoused then by Alexander Heidel and others is the right one. This means then that Genesis 1:1 is not a heading for the whole chapter. It is a declaration about the beginning of the process, which then is the development of which is further described from verses 2 and following. But now let's read on then. Before his deeds of old, I was appointed from everlasting, before the world began, when there were no oceans. All right, now think of the process in Genesis 1, right there in connection with the opening verses as they flow into day one. Of course, it's water everywhere. There is the deep and the darkness with, of course, the Spirit over it. But as for the earthly world, it is all water. It is all deep in darkness. And in fact, after the darkness is dealt with on day one by the introduction of light and the separation of light from and darkness and the setting up of the sequel of day and night. After that, then day 2 and 3 go on to deal with the deep. You start there, the Spirit over deep and darkness. The darkness is dealt with first, how it is bounded. Then the deep is dealt with, how it is bounded. On day 2, it is bounded vertically by the introduction of the rakia, the firmament, which separates the waters above the clouds from the waters below, which will become the seas. And then on the third day, those lower waters are bounded horizontally by the raising up of the dry land, and so separating things that way. But at the outset, it is just water, and now here, wisdom is saying, I was here before that earliest stage, which is reflected in days 1 and 2 and even 3. When there were no oceans, I was given birth. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains were settled. So you've come along from that deep and darkness stage now to the, in terms of Genesis 1, to the third day when the land was produced and the mountains were raised up. And wisdom was there before the mountains were settled, before the hills. I was given birth, before he made the earth or its fields or any of the dust of the earth. Again, you are plainly at the end of the first triad in Genesis 1, when the land and the vegetation have been produced. Wisdom was there before each of these steps in the process. In the beginning is before any of those things. In the beginning is that I'm not going to say it was that point in time, that absolute point in time. I think the right way to say it is in the beginning is that whole first phase in creation, from the absolute beginning to the point which is picked up in Genesis 1 verse 2, which now looks at the earth and describes it at a stage when it was covered by deep and darkness. However long that period was between the absolute beginning and the point which is picked up in Genesis 1 verse 2, that is the beginning period. If you accept the general modern approach to cosmogony, it would be the point in time from the Big Bang until the Lord had developed the whole cosmos with its developing star systems and galaxies to the point where our galaxy and our solar system and our planet Earth had emerged, and planet Earth then stands here by itself, a period of 10 billion years, whatever. In the beginning is that first phase then. I mean, you don't have to buy everything I just said about the length of time. But in the beginning is that first phase, however long or short it was, from the absolute beginning to the point picked up in Genesis 1, verse 2. Well, that's verses then 22 through 26. Now what is interesting is that having brought us up to day 3 in terms of Genesis 1 with the land and the mountains and so on, now wisdom backtracks in order to tell us that she was not only there before these things, but she had a hand in all of these things. So verse 27 says, I was there when he set the heavens in place. I was there during that process. I was present and involved. I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep. Now this reminds us sort of day 4, but also of day 1. And not remarkably so, since as a matter of fact, day 4 and day 1, day 4 recapitulates day 1, and so that's the picture here, and that we are back before day 3 comes out again in verse 28, when wisdom says, when he established the clouds above and fixed securely the fountains of the deep. Now when was that? When did he fix the clouds above and the foundations of the deep beneath? That was clearly in connection with the second day, when as we said, by the introduction of the firmament, he separated the waters above with the clouds from the waters below. And incidentally, there's your interpretation of the waters above, about which there is discussion. And for example, Dr. Young, in his treatment of things, understood the waters above as some waters belonging to outer space out there somewhere mysterious. We don't know what. No, I mean, there's nothing mysterious about it. They are the clouds. The waters above, produced by the atmosphere and the whole cycle of distillation, so are simply the clouds. And so there, Genesis 1, day 2, when he established the clouds above and separated from the fountains of the deep below, wisdom was there. So you see how we're going back to the beginning again. We've already been from the beginning up to the third day. Now we're back and going up the same process again, because that's what happens in Genesis 1. And here's an inspired interpretation of it. The framework interpretation is not some Johnny-come-lately 20th century development of some maverick idiot. It's the earliest interpretation that you can find right within the Bible itself. That's the way it's treated here. And verse 29 then goes on now to the fourth day once again, when he gave the sea its boundaries, so that the waters would not overstep his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth. Wisdom was there at each step of that process. And having said that, now you come to the punchline in verse 30. She was not only there before that, she was not only present during that, but her role during all of that was the Hebrew word is amon. And then I was the amon. I like the translation in Bible I have find here. I don't know what you have in yours. This one says, then I was the craftsman at his side, the master builder, the architect. Wisdom was the one that drew up the architectonic plans for the creation that guided the whole process of creation, so that the Lord, as he followed that plan day by day, and at the end of the day looked at what he had achieved and he compared it with wisdom's plan, he was able to say, it is good, it is good. That's the meaning of that phrase all the time, that verdict, that word of self-judgment that God pronounces on his works during that process. It is good. It's not just some moral declaration about things. It's an architectural, structural worker statement that what he has made accords with the architect plan of wisdom. Then I was there as the master builder at his side, and that thought of it is good, God taking delight in his work day by day, comes out here in wisdom. Wisdom saw that it was good. She was pleased. And so she says, I was filled with delight day after day, yom by yom. See, there is another good clue as to the fact that Genesis 1 is in view, that the succession of days, yom, yom, yom. Yom by yom, she says, I was there filled with delight as the process continued, rejoicing in his whole world. And now we're coming up to the end of the process when God saw that everything was very good, and when he had made the climactic creature, his image bearer, man. And she says, rejoicing in his whole world and delighting, with special emphasis, delighting in mankind, in this earthly Elohim type creature. So I think that's a magnificent passage, and just so relevant to all the basic questions we are trying to ask at this particular point. So we see an account of creation, a poetic meditation development of Genesis 1 that interprets it in such a way that straightforward chronology yields to thematic treatment. And along the way, we have had our answer to the question, what does Bereshith mean? It means in the beginning, back before these other developments, not coextensive with them, not a heading for the whole chapter. All right, now the rest of Genesis 1, verse 1, the heavens and the earth. And on the view that it would be a heading for the whole chapter, as we said, this would refer to the well-ordered universe. On this view, that it refers to a beginning period long short of the completion of the well-ordered universe. What does heaven and earth mean? And now the point I want to make here essentially is this. Some would say that heaven and earth is just sort of a summarizing way of saying everything. Everything. And idiomatically, in Hebrew elsewhere, you have that way of expressing totality by use of antonyms, opposites. You use two opposites to describe totality. When you want to say that the Lord is always faithfully watching over us and caring for us, we make the point, he watches over us in our going out and our coming in, opposites. In our rising up and our sitting down, opposites to express totality. And so some would say that that's the whole force of heaven and earth, just that he made everything without thinking distinctively of what is earth and what is heaven and what distinctions there might be between them. Over against that view, I want to suggest the thought that heaven and earth here should be each taken, yes indeed they do add up to everything, but you just can't blur their distinctiveness and their difference in that more general idea of everything, but you have to recognize an interesting difference between them. Now let's see, in my I will be making use along the way, even before we ultimately come to deal with it more as such. I'll be making use of this article, Space and Time, and the Genesis Cosmogony. Do y'all find this over there someplace to get if you want? Some my heads are going like this, so it is available. And if you haven't got it, you want to get hold of it. On page 7, in that, well, I'm not sure it would be page 7 in the actual publication. This is just an earlier, I guess, typescript of the thing. I don't know how they got repaged, but let's see. Under the heading in Cosmology of the Genesis Prologue, Roman 2, and then under that A, the space coordinate, and under that 1, 2 register spaces. So that would be where this material comes, and as I say here, it's on my page 7. The phrase denotes concretely the actual 2 components that together comprehend all of creation. That does indeed amount to everything. But in translating it, the separate specific identity of each of these 2 components must be preserved. And one thing demanding this is that verse 2, resuming the earth of verse 1, treats it by itself as a distinct individual sphere. Now, more precisely, what Genesis 1:1 affirms is that God created not just the spatial dimensions immediately accessible to man, but the heavens too. That is, the invisible realm of the divine glory and angelic beings. All right, now there is a whole biblical cosmology assumed in that, and in this article, then colleagues here said that Platonic idea is not a biblical concept. Nonsense. It's all we're talking about is the biblical idea that there's heaven and earth. I will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This was not some Platonic philosophizing world of ideas that Jesus was producing here. God on his throne. The Bible's full of this. We all know this, don't we? God on his throne in the midst of his angels. You can't see it, can you? All right, but it's there. It's real. That's heaven in the sense of the invisible heaven. It's over against the earth, which is the visible realm. And how to describe all of these things, that's what is so difficult, because we can't conceptualize the invisible. It's precisely that which is beyond our conceptualizing. It is invisible to us. We don't have entree into that at this point. And so there's that upper register, and here's the lower register. And how to describe them? The lower register is that realm of the 4 dimensions to which we have access, the 3 spatial dimensions and time. That's the world in which we live and operate, and we have access to and can experience and so on. And now there are other, if you will, for lack of some better word, there are other dimensions beside the 4 that we are familiar with. And when we are at last glorified, this distinction between an upper and lower register will cease to be significant, because the whole thing is described from our perspective anthropocentrically, and it's only while we are in our present earthly bodies then that we do not have access to the invisible world. When at last we are glorified, which has always been God's intention. It was God's intention in the original creation of the world, and Adam failed to bring us along toward that happy consummation. Redemptively, Jesus, the second Adam, does bring us at last to that. Even now, we aren't there yet. Glorification is a distinctively physical phenomenon that comes later on. When we are glorified, then we'll be able to see, what is now invisible. Then those dimensions will also have been opened up to us. Those dimensions of glory. This is the dimension where the glory of God fills that whole realm, and is apparently can be experienced by angels and so on out there, but not yet by us. And we live down here in these earthly ones. Now, God does do is that he funnels down into our 4-dimensional experience little miniaturized forms of his heavenly glory. And when that comes down to earth, as in Israel's experience, they see it in the form of the glory cloud that led them through the wilderness and that filled the tabernacle, which was an earthy architectural reproduction of heaven and so on. So that's the way things are now. There's this invisible realm up there, and that's what I'm saying is called heaven in Genesis 1, verse 1. And then there's also the visible dimensions. When we're glorified, the whole thing will be opened up to us, and the distinction will no longer be significant. We will be able to function in all of these dimensions. That's a whole big business, this matter of biblical cosmology, and we'll be doing trying to say a lot more with it along the way, especially when we come to deal with this particular article as such, and later on when we are dealing with the phenomenon of the glory cloud as a theophany. And there was a hand over there someplace. Yes.
So you would see this sort of reflected in Paul saying Galatians 4, talking about the heavenly and earthly Jerusalem, the writer of Hebrews, perhaps in Hebrews 9, talking about things above and below.
Well, okay. The particular passage that, if I may read from this, that I think is the best one, is the one in Colossians. Okay. So more precisely, then, if I can get back then to just reading from this article, what is affirmed here is not just the spatial dimensions immediately accessible to us, but the heavens, the invisible realm of the divine glory and angelic beings. This interpretation is reflected in Paul's Christological exposition of Genesis 1:1. Paul looks at Genesis 1 and he interprets what's going on there in terms of Christ. Just as the prologue to the Gospel of John we refer to there does the same thing in terms of Christ as the eternal Logos, the role that the Logos played. There's a Christological treatment of Genesis 1:1 and John 1:1. Paul does the same thing in Colossians in 1:16, and what he says then is this, that the Son, S-O-N, the Son of God, created all things that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. So clearly reflecting on Genesis 1:1, Paul interprets this as involving things both visible and invisible. In fact, he emphasizes the invisible, which would be the domain of what he refers to as thrones, dominions, principalities, and powers. So I think that is a very helpful verse for understanding heaven and earth. But further, likewise Nehemiah, if you look at Nehemiah chapter 9, there's that interesting long prayer of Nehemiah, and within that he is also reflecting clearly on the Genesis creation account, and he finds there a reference to the invisible realm of the angels. He refers to the angels, Nehemiah 6, as being there. The only possible referent then for what he is referring to is the heavens of Genesis 1, verse 1. So these what are we doing? We're functioning by a basic hermeneutical principle here, the analogy of Scripture, all right? And so the analogy of Scripture, Nehemiah 9, Colossians 1, indicates this view of Genesis 1:1, that the heavens are the invisible heaven. Now, other arguments from the immediate context, right from the context of Genesis 1 itself, there, the visible heaven, see, there's the invisible heaven, and then within the visible world of these four dimensions that we experience, there is another heaven. So we can distinguish heaven in terms of the visible heaven. And now what I'm saying is that as you move along in Genesis 1, and you're dealing with the earth from verse 2 and following, the first verse distinguishes heaven from earth. Then from verse 2 and following, it picks up the earth and begins to describe that. And lo and behold, it's out of the earth of Genesis 1, verse 1, which is continued in verse 2, it's out of that earth that the visible heavens actually emerge. And therefore, the heavens that emerge from this earth cannot be the same as the heavens, which are distinguished from this earth in verse 1. That's the simple argument. Let me just read it again for you then here. In the context of Genesis 1, the visible heaven, or firmament, is derived from what is called the earth in verses 1 and 2. What is the visible heaven? In biblical terminology, the visible heaven is that thing that you see up there that looks a little cloudy today, or the blue vault if it's a nice clear day. The dome. It's not something solid. This is just the language of appearance. We look up and it looks like that. It's a sort of a figurative way of referring to it. The firmament that God created, and that in biblical terminology is equated with the Shemayim, with the heavens. And the clouds associated with it are in biblical terminology the heavens. What we are given to think of most of the time when we talk about the visible heavens is the astral heavens, outer space, deep space, and the realm of the stars. And, in biblical terminology, the stars are not the heavens. They are, again, in the figurative language of biblical imagery, the stars are the luminaries. They are the lights that God hung up there in the ceiling over the world in which we live. And so in biblical language, the heavens, the visible heavens, is just this cloud formation. How is it produced? It's produced by the atmosphere. What did God produce on day 2? He produced the atmosphere. And it is the atmosphere then that results in the appearance of that blue dome over us up there, and it's that the Bible calls heaven. And that visible heaven, what we're saying, is derived by taking the waters of the earth, of the visible earth, and separating them, and with the clouds above and the waters beneath, and the firmament itself in the midst of that. Now let me just read one other paragraph from bringing up an objection that some people have to this approach and wanting to defend the other view that heavens and earth are describing some oppose construing Genesis 1 and 2 as I have, because they insist the phrase the heavens and the earth always signifies the finished product. Not as it would be on my view, the earth wouldn't be certainly the finished product. And the objection is that whenever you get the combination heaven and earth in the Bible, what is being described is the finished product, not some earlier form such as the earth would be on my view. That is what is usually said. And hence they say the earth that appears in that phrase in verse 1 cannot be the unfinished, uninhabitable place called earth in verse 2. But now you can make a study of your concordance for yourself, and my conclusion is that contrary to that often repeated claim, and you hear it all the time, in other appearances of the phrase the heavens and the earth in Scripture, the idea that these realms were finished and inhabited is not what is signified by this phrase itself, but would have to be supplied by the context. And even if all the references after Genesis 1:1 happen to be to heaven and earth in such a finished state, that would not be determinative for Genesis 1:1 context, which deals with the very process of developing the product from an empty to a furnished, finished condition. As a matter of fact, it may well be that in all the appearances of the heavens and the earth, over half of which are allusions to the creation account, acknowledging the Lord as the one who is the maker of the heavens and the earth, and it may well be that in all of these, what the phrase really signifies is precisely the invisible and visible realms, not the well-ordered, well-finished universe. And so there's no reason then here to resist what we have found to be the clear direction of Proverbs 8:22 and 23 for the interpretation of Genesis 1:1 as referring to an earlier juncture, not to a later stage when the earth had become habitable for man. In point of fact, though the visible realm, the earth, was not completed until the end of the creation week. All right, I would insist that the earth in Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1 verse 2 is not the completed thing. It's the earth is not completed until the end of the 6-day process. On the other hand, when Genesis 1:1 speaks about the heavens and the earth, I think then that the heavens are completed immediately. The heavens are created mature, if you will. The earth is, the visible dimensions of thing are created as something which has to undergo this process. The way I sometimes put it for fun is that in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. If you want to try to synchronize this with modern cosmogony, Big Bang type thing, you could say that the event which was in terms of the lower register, the visible register, the Big Bang, is from the point of view of the upper register, the heavens, the epiphanic flash, or the big flash. It was the production of the glory, the heavens, and I would think that early on, if not immediately on, populated by all of the angelic hosts of heaven. There is evidence in the Bible, which I also then try to point out here, that the angels themselves are already present and on the scene. Wisdom was there from the beginning of, as she says, the divine wisdom, but the evidence also is that the angels, as they are creatures, of course, but they are created early on, and they are said to be on the scene in connection with the ongoing process of developing the visible heavens and the earth. Let's see if I can find a quote for you. Job 38 verse 7 would be something you might like to consult in that connection. Job 38 verse 7. Job 38 verse 7 indicates that these heavenly celestial sons of God, the angels, existed at the point in Earth's development described back in Genesis 1:2 and following. They were there singing for joy when the Lord was creating these things. They were heavenly witnesses to the ongoing process of creation. And so in the light of that kind of evidence, I think that this is the way to understand Genesis 1:1, that in the beginning God created the heavens pretty much as a finished product. And then he also had created the earth, but not as we now see it, not as a finished thing, but something which was then undergo a development. Genesis 1:2 picks the story up at that particular point, late in history as I see it, and when the earth was without form and void, then there was darkness over the face of the deep. So Genesis 1 verse 1, any questions on our approach to that? Then what our intention would be now then would be to go back and to pick up the argument for the framework hypothesis and go through that. Yes, sir, please.
In terms of this cosmogony, when you look at...
Please speak up loudly for the deaf professor.
Okay. So they're talking about the new heavens and the earth and
Yes.
the eschaton. Are they talking about the lower register or the whole cosmogony?
Well, what I'm trying to say here is that in Genesis 1:1, the heavens is the invisible world, and the earth comprises everything visible, out of which ultimately I was arguing the heavens in the form of the firmament are derived, so that the visible heavens are derivative from what is called earth here. But in Genesis 1:1, that earth is distinguished from another heavens which isn't derivative from it and must therefore be the invisible. That was my argument.
So the new heavens and the new earth is new.
New heavens and the new earth would be a heavens and earth in which this whole upper lower register was no longer significant, because when the new heavens and earth are produced, we are there in glorified form, and the visible invisible distinction has disappeared by then.
Is this viewpoint on Genesis 1:1 critical for the rest of the framework?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. I just want-
No. Yeah. You mean you don't like it?
So those who would, they're hearing this, maybe misunderstanding this, say, gee, it sounds awfully Kantian, numinal, phenomenal, or Platonic. How would you explain what they're misunderstanding or the difference?
Because all I'm talking about, I would ask them whether they think that the whole Bible and talking about, God's heaven and our earth, whether that is Kantian and numinal and Platonic. I hope they don't think that the whole Bible is, and that's all I'm talking about here, is the distinction between God's heaven and our earth.
Do you think...
I mean, they're both real.
Right.
It's not just some abstract world of ideas. This is reality. It just happens to be a form of reality that in our present earthly bodies we can't handle and conceptualize. But that doesn't make it any less real. It's no less real than God is real and the angels are real and that our Lord and His ascended experience is real, and that the saints who have departed and are with the Lord are real. They're all part of that realm. This is...
Well, I'm thinking, and how I would answer is that one, in Platonic dualism, is the two cannot interact. And in Kantianism, the two can't interact, so you can't know the numinal. In contrast to the Scriptures, where the Scriptures, we have someone coming from heaven to earth. We have an interaction from one to the other. And that
and of course in their system, the whole part of a monistic system that hasn't any room for the creator-creature concept, all kinds of major distinctions between them. But to try to distance just this new vocabulary, upper and lower register, from the biblical heaven and earth language, and to treat it as if it's a heresy while accepting the complete nonsense, because it doesn't understand at all what I'm saying. I'm just using another term for the biblical reality.
Why did you choose to introduce the new language? Was it just for clarification purposes?
I suppose so. I was trying to bring out the visible distinction, these other dimensions, the lower dimensions, and just as some other terminology that might do it, I guess. But what I intended for clarification did the opposite with some people.
What is the relation of Genesis 2:1 to Genesis 1:1 with that, where then
It's a summary, and the question is whether included in that summary in 2:1 is the first verse or just everything from 1:2 on. Not so sure how to answer that one, but it's not vital to any of these points.
I can understand this concept of God creating the upper register, but still God's eternal, so the throne always has to be even above this upper.
No, I think that's it's a very widespread, I think that almost everyone talks that way. That when we read in the Bible about heaven, that we think it is talking about God's eternal before and apart from creation existence, and it isn't. Wherever heaven appears in the Bible, it's a created reality. It's part of creation. And God, in His eternal being in existence apart from that, is something else. And that's a very important thing, and something it's everywhere. You've been counting all the time. Everyone seems to think that the picture of God on His throne in the midst of His angels is the way it has always been. No. Angels are created. They had a beginning, and that whole setting had a beginning. In Genesis 1 is the beginning of heaven. Heaven does not exist before Genesis 1. Whatever you want to call it, you're going to have to get some new vocabulary for it. But God, the eternal, God, can't begin to talk about it already.
Beyond common space.
That is not heaven. That is just something else, whatever we're going to call it.
He's in a sense the eternal mind. I mean, with all His attributes and everything He is.
There's eternity out there, and of course then there's the created eternity, which has a beginning but no end. But there's the eternity of God, which is apart from all of this. So maybe that is as good a word as any to use for that other thing. So eternity is not heaven. Okay, that I think is got to take a lot of readjusting of people's thinking. But heaven is part of creation. It had a beginning.
Any idea where His house was before that?
Huh?
Any idea where His house was before that?
His house? He is His own house, even of course within creation.
What do we have to understand by the invisible heaven, which is mentioned?
I'm not getting this.
What do we have to understand by the invisible heaven, which is mentioned first in Genesis, as you are saying? If that heaven is not the one that we see, the atmosphere, we see the firmament, what are we to understand by that invisible heaven?
Oh, what do you understand when it talks about God in his heaven with his angels? What do you understand by that?
Yeah.
Huh? Whatever you understand by that is what I would understand by heaven in Genesis 1, verse 1.
Why I ask the question is, we are told in the beginning God created heaven and earth.
Yes.
And then we are told about the earth, what has happened on earth, and then we are told what happens in heaven. There's the stars and the sun, the moon.
That's the visible heaven. That's made out of the earth. That's no longer the Genesis 1 heavens, which is separate from all of that. There's a visible heavens and an invisible heavens. And it turns out to be part of a whole pattern where you not only have, and that's one of the main things that we're talking about in this article, you not only have an upper register and a lower register that are distinct from one another, but what you find is that in the process of creation, the realities of the upper register sort of get reproduced and echoed and mirrored in what's going on in the lower register. So I use the example, for example, of the glory of God which fills heaven, which we can see, but that is reproduced in earthly experience in the form of that localized glory cloud. Right? It's just a whole series of these replications in the mind. God is in heaven. He reproduces his likeness in an earth creature, in man. God is in his heavens up there. He reproduces the reality of heaven, that high exalted place within the visible register in the heavens, that high exalted place above the visible. And so it's that kind of relationship between them. But time for our 5-minute break. And because, as I said, I'm suffering from framework view, of course, is a figurative view, as is the day-age view. The solar day view is the only literal view. And then the day-age view is a figurative view, and as much as it takes the picture of a 7-day week with evenings and mornings in a figurative way that's able to understand it of long periods of time in terms of duration. It's able to stretch the thing out. It doesn't see these as solar days, but it sees them as actually 6 epochs or eras and 8 ages in the process of creation, whereas then the framework interpretation takes it figuratively in a much more intense way, and that the framework view says, yes, indeed, the picture that we have here is the picture that the solar day people insist on. It's the picture of a regular series of days, as over against the day-age view. I'm agreeing here with the solar day view that the picture that's presented is that of a series of 7 regular days with their evenings and mornings. And what we are saying, however, is that the ultimate question is not what is the picture, but is the picture intended literally, or is it intended figuratively? And so the framework interpretation is saying, yeah, this picture of 7 solar days with the 7th day is something that needs some further qualification, but this picture of a week of days with their evenings and mornings is something which was intended figuratively. Now mind you, the framework interpretation is not saying Genesis 1, period, overall, everything is figurative. That's not the position. The position is that the chronological data, the language about 7 days with their evenings and mornings, the chronological data, that is a figure of speech. Not that the whole chapter is figure, not that everything that's said within the chapter, just the chronological data provide a figurative framework for the account of these other things, which are not figurative. They might have a figurative touch here or there, but as a whole, what we're talking about is just the chronological data framework. Now, arguing for the figurative character of that chronological data, point 1 will be to take a look at the form, the literary form, and to note that it is more poetic than it is prose, or whatever you want to call it, semi-poetic or poetic. And we will be saying then that the poetic form of the thing at least sets the stage, creates something of an assumption that within it we will find figures of speech. It doesn't do more than that, but it does do that much, and it at least alerts us to the possibility, simply because in poetry you do get strong figures of speech. You get them in prose too, but if it's in general poetic, then all the more anticipation of figures of speech. So that's the first point, just establishing a certain possibility or probability of the figurative treatment. The second argument there that we develop is the one from the seventh day. And here our argument then is that by the analogy of Scripture, the seventh day turns out not to be a literal solar day, but it turns out to be, I was just about to use the word eternity, and we've just gone through these discussions where we've tried to now use the word eternal in a little more precise way. All right, so God's eternity apart from creation, that's no beginning, no end. Now, if we're going to use the word eternal in terms of created things, it's in a different sense. It's in the sense that they're unending, but it has a beginning. All right, and so what I'm saying about the Sabbath day is it's eternal in that sense. It has a beginning, but it's unending. It certainly, therefore, is not literal. The seventh day is not literal, and so the seventh day forbids a literal view of Genesis 1. You really can't believe in the harmony of the Bible and hold to a literal view of Genesis, the 1 chronology. The seventh day forbids it. And so the seventh day not just suggests the possibility of something figurative, it demands it. And then the third argument that I would be developing on this line has to do with the whole thesis of that last article, Space and Time in the Genesis Cosmogony, that we got into a little bit here at the last hour, and but the whole thesis of that article is that in terms of upper, lower register, the question then becomes, in which register does the time language of Genesis 1 apply? Where do you put that? Is it referring to lower register? It's referring to upper register will be the argument we follow there. It's referring to what's going on in heaven, God on his throne, and so on. And the point is that what is going on up there, where time is not experienced as solar time at all, that realm is described in terms of the earthly replica at time down below. And so